Good day, everybody, and welcome to The Professors. I'm Paul Fabrizio.
And I'm Don Frazier, and we're joined by Jeffrey Kinlaw from the Philosophy and Religion Department at McMurry University.
Yes, indeed. And good day, welcome. And today we're going to have an elevated discussion because we're talking to a philosopher.
That's
right?
Not an elevator discussion.
No, an elevated discussion.
That's important because an elevator discussion would be much shorter.
The 5-minute speech.
That's right.
The
5
5-second.
second. Yeah, whatever.
All right, Dr. Kinlaw, welcome.
Thank you.
And you are a professor in the Religion and Philosophy Department at McMurry University, and you've been here for how long?
Almost 20 years, believe it or not.
Okay. And tell us, what does a philosopher do?
Well, see, that is a nice way to frame the question because, excuse me, my allergies are still killing me.
It's springtime in Texas.
Anyway, exactly. There's not only the study, and there's not only the idea of the study of philosophy, but there's doing it as well.
You study it and you do it.
Well, but I'm going to say to doing it. I mean, think of the historian. The historian doesn't simply study history. The study, in the sense that the historian writes history, or presumably should.
Yeah, should. And interprets
but
history.
in other words, the philosophers actually, colloquially use the expression "doing philosophy." Historians don't say we do history; they write history. But it's more or less the same thing. So, I mean, there's the idea. It's that philosophy deals with fundamental questions, and when you say of life, but that doesn't tell you much.
Okay, so what is a fundamental question?
Well, as we're saying, a fundamental question is basically a question that, or an issue that other disciplines do not deal with or may take for granted.
Or take as given, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, think of this, and I don't, I know very little about philosophy and mathematics, so I will refuse to go there. But mathematicians, as a rule, are not concerned with whether mathematical objects exist.
Okay.
I mean, think about it.
They just assume they exist.
Yeah, no.
Oh, they don't?
I don't know.
In all
cases, I mean,
I'm trying to think of what is a mathematical object.
Well, I mean, for instance,
a cube.
Do triangles exist?
Is there such a thing as a triangle?
Well, no, they're triangles. They're individual triangles, but do they exist? Now, for Plato, the answer, traditionally Plato, the answer was yes. I mean, because you had a standard of what genuinely a triangle was, and everything else is an imperfect instantiation or embodiment of that universal principle. Let's get it. Let's get a little more familiar. I mean, in the sense, does justice exist?
Or truth.
All right. Well, but let's really go with justice. Does justice exist?
Does justice exist?
Does it exist? Well, I mean,
my first thing is I would struggle with what is the definition of justice.
Well, but think about it. Aside from what the definition, okay, if you can define it, you've got an objective sense of what justice is. It's an objective value. But the question is, does it actually? I mean, Plato thought it actually existed, apart from instances of justice.
Huh? So you could actually send it a postcard. It would have a street address.
Of course, no. Of course not.
Not that kind
but
of
anyway.
But what does exist?
But anyway,
mean?
but really back to, this gets us astray a bit, but getting back to a fundamental question, I mean, you deal with questions that other disciplines take for granted. Political scientists are not interested unless they're theorists. And, as we know, a political theorist and political philosophers cross back and forth, and some departments like ours, because we're not big enough to spend, to commit to an entire position on political philosophy. I mean, my undergraduate alma mater has a fairly large department, one political philosopher. Well, that's their, it's not unusual. But the political scientists aren't interested in whether, what is an ideal government, what constitutes a legitimate government, and so forth. They're not interested in those questions. They're not interested in whether, if you're a scientist, you're not interested in what the nature and status of scientific theories are, historically or otherwise. You don't deal with that. You don't deal with the principle of causation, of cause and effect.
You just accept
You assume them. You assume
Yeah.
it. You don't find scientists dealing with the principle of cause and effect. Philosophers deal with it. Scientists don't. I mean, historians don't. I mean, for instance, the historians are sensitive to, and I'm sure, this is something that drives historians nuts when other disciplines do historical work and confuse, contiguity and causation.
Yeah,
drives historians nuts. I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
But
most of us are nuts to begin with.
Yeah, but I mean, you had proper understanding and proper training and as a real historian, you wouldn't make this mistake. But the idea, what constitutes cause and effect in historical processes, for instance, is not something most historians are dealing with.
So
they take that for granted.
So you're saying that your job as a philosopher, or at least the field, is to deal with fundamental questions that we in our lives don't deal with, we just accept. And in essence, you're challenging the foundations of our knowledge.
In a certain sense, yes. And for instance, philosophers, of course, spend a whole lot of time on epistemology. In fact, that's
define
the theory of knowledge.
Okay.
Theory of knowledge. And a lot of people spend a lot of time on, that's a whole distinct discipline within philosophy.
Okay.
But not only that, to really be good as a philosopher, you've got to have some sort of good foundation in epistemology because it has tentacles into all over the place. But most people aren't concerned with what constitutes knowledge and how we provide justification for what we know.
How we know what we know.
Yeah.
How we know what we
or to
know.
deal with, or to
how do we know it,
or to deal with skepticism.
Yeah.
That's a philosopher's job. That's what they deal with, and the thing about it is, a good theologian is going to have to deal with work, with epistemological issues, and when she or he does so, they're going to borrow from the work that philosophers have done.
Does philosophy come before theology?
What do you mean by come before?
Does philosophy have to exist before there can be theology? In other words, do you have to have a discussion of an understanding of basic things of knowledge before you can discuss and understand or study God?
Historically, I think that philosophy comes after theology.
Or they never split.
Or they just never split.
No, actually they don't. It comes theology, religion and theology being different, but you got philosophy usually traced back to the 8th century, BCE.
Right. The love of
you
wisdom.
didn't have theology then. Back then you had, the origins of what we call philosophy was not separated from cosmology or natural science. The concern prior to the sophist and to Socrates was what's the ultimate structure of the world?
Yeah.
Or the way things are.
Let's run this string all the way to the root and figure out
what's the ultimate structure of the world.
Yeah.
So it's basic. I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, and I've got a question then. If philosophy is the love of wisdom and wisdom is running an issue all the way down to its root element, what is a PhD? Because there's philosophy in the name of, you have one, I have one, we all have one. What's it mean?
Well, what is it historically? It goes back to when all degrees were
philosophy degrees.
Philosophy degrees. It's Middle Ages.
Because you've run a topic all the way down to its root.
Well, but because philosophy had that integrative function
Sure.
of being the sort of master science or discipline, science in the
Broad sense.
sense and broad sense.
Do you feel that philosophy has lost something because now it's not?
Well, I mean,
it's not
well,
seen
in a
that
certain
way.
sense, the part of the problem that philosophy faces, and it really is, and this is a discussion among professional philosophers. I mean,
Mhm.
it is that it has become so specialized.
Right.
Mm.
Right.
A lot of that going around.
I
Yeah,
mean, but
that's
think
the danger
of
in all of our
think of
professions.
in since we got our degrees, or let's back up. Since you and I were in college,
Okay, and
right about the time before we get to college, we had to break.
we're
Yeah,
going
we're
to
going
have
to
to
take a break, but I want you to unpack that when we get back because I have a feeling we're about to fall over a precipice.
Yes,
on
indeed.
this conversation.
Watch
All right,
out.
We'll be right back.
Bear Leader Tours. Where will Bear Leader Tours take you? Everywhere. Paris, Bruges, Trier, battlefields, Pearl Harbor, Pacific beaches, Louisiana, Guadalcanal, Rome. Join the adventure.
www.mcwhinney.org.
And we're back, and I'm Paul Fabrizio.
I'm Don Frazier, and we're joined by Jeffrey Kinlaw, our colleague from one floor down. over
That's
in
right.
Old Main.
In our old main building.
What I was saying before is that the problem, consider this.
Uh-huh.
Prior to 1970,
Okay.
the people who worked on free will and moral responsibility, or theories of free will, for instance, they
Mhm.
dealt with that issue.
Mhm.
Prior to about 1970, not only was that issue more or less handled in the same way it was handled 200 years before,
Mhm.
but you would categorize free will under some other heading.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it would be under what are the disciplines within philosophy? In other words, what are the specialties, the sub-disciplines within philosophy? Well, now it's a categorization all its own.
All by itself. It's kind of grown its own industry.
Because it's become a cottage industry.
Okay.
And to really, I teach free will, and I use my work and my teaching competence. I use that in some of my research and writing, but I don't work in that area itself. Were I to choose to do so, I would have to confine myself to that almost entirely because there's just so much going on. Now, some people have done their work in that and then moved to something else.
Mm-hmm.
But there's just so much out there. About 1970, it just absolutely exploded.
Now, what always gets me, especially in the industry of higher education, is we talk about our disciplines and our sub-disciplines and things like that, but the average 18-year-old coming in, they haven't a clue on what we do. We're supposed
Correct.
to teach them philosophy or history or political science, and beyond that, all the nuances and stuff that a lot of times we as scholars get wrapped up in is completely lost on that age bracket. So how do you keep your interest in scholarship and in your field alive and also handle some of the challenges of teaching at a small liberal arts school where, the conversation we're having here is probably over their head?
Well, one of the things that that one would hope for in a place like where we are,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
but and also those of us who are really committed seriously to writing and churning out good work,
Mm-hmm.
as good philosophy, good history, whatever, is to a lot of times, and at least this has happened to me, is that some of the things I've written on, the problems I've pursued,
Mm-hmm.
thought about for an extended period of time, arose out of classes I've taught. Because I've had to deal with those issues.
Yeah.
And I can provide something, here's a way of handling this, or here's the standard ways of handling this problem.
Mm-hmm.
But, for a average undergraduate.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're going to get at a more sophisticated level and a deeper level of trying to deal with that problem. And, you should be able to take the work you do and to translate it into an everyday classroom setting. You should be able to. I mean, with some understanding. I mean,
right.
the student who arrives in college with a weak mathematics background and has as his or her plan is to get through, say, college algebra,
sure,
or some form of finite mathematics.
That'd have been me. Yeah.
I want to get through this.
And me.
Yeah.
I want to get through this.
Right.
And that person, of course, is not going to follow very closely a presentation that a physicist makes to a group of physics students, obviously, because of the mathematics. Even if maybe that student shouldn't even be taking physics because of the mathematics. Okay, but that person should be able to translate these, the more complex.
The student or the professor?
The professor. That professor should be able to translate complex issues and concepts into everyday understandings, everyday practice, everyday life that an undergraduate should be able to follow. I mean,
exactly.
We know full well. I mean, and philosophers are well known for this. But I mean, you encounter this in literature. I mean, in philosophers who are doing really creative work, they're dealing with something that they're dealing with a solution to a problem that really hasn't been presented. And so what they do is they develop their own technical vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
The jargon.
Well, but it's not jargon because the good ones, the technical vocabulary is lucid. But you've got to spend the time to see through it and to examine it, and it becomes really quite clear. You understand why that person used that expression.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, Hegel's notorious for that, but usually
Hegel
is notorious for that. But yet the technical vocabulary is really quite clear. But what you have to do, since it's idiosyncratic. Or it may employ neologisms, and you have to go. I mean,
Hegel and neologisms.
You're having to coin a word to use in a space. Well, you should be able to say, look, here's what this means. In fact, good analytic philosophy is able to say, this is what this means.
Right.
Okay, that I understood.
Right.
And
I mean,
that's one of the.
In any of our fields, we have our own specialized vocabulary, but our job is to take the specialized stuff and make it understandable for undergrads. And not just,
what I'd call a general educated audience. And undergrads counts as a general educated audience.
Exactly.
I'd buy that. All right, so what's a Hegel and what's a neologism?
Well, you're coining a word to use to employ as a particular concept.
Okay. But Hegel was a philosopher.
Hegel was a philosopher.
Early 19th century German philosopher.
Okay. So
known for difficult technical vocabulary. But once you understand that vocabulary, it doesn't remove all the difficulty. But it's really quite clear.
But it ends up being like a Rosetta Stone to explain exactly what's going on inside of his head.
But particularly when you're not, when you're 200 years away from the actual actual publication of the material, or the actual, in the case, if you're reading publications of what were manuscripts of lectures, of the actual presentation of the lecture, So
interesting.
Okay.
Just being able to cook it down to the essential elements and to talk about it. So we've got the idea of what philosophy is and kind of how it should be applied in a setting like where we teach. But what I'd like to talk about in the next segment is kind of how you came to be at McMurry.
Yes.
What your background is and why anybody on earth, much less our students, should care anything about philosophy. I'd be curious, because y'all get a bad rap, probably second only to us in the history business as far as being useless things to understand. We'll be right back.
History has become one of the most fought-over battlegrounds in terms of shifting people's views and opinions about their country. In response to this, we have decided to launch a website called Go To History that will become your home for clear-eyed history content. Our objective is to put history out there, free of agendas, and allow you, the viewers, to decide what you believe and decide how to interpret this information. With experienced professors such as Dr. Don Frazier and Dr. Stephen Hardin teaching courses and creating agenda-free content for students and just plain history enthusiasts, the content of Go To History is vastly informative and unbiased.
History people, it's Phil Collins here. I am just giving a shout out to a couple of guys that you're going to be hearing from. And they're good friends of mine, but they're also incredibly knowledgeable historians. Dr. Donald Frazier and Dr. Stephen Hardin. Both great friends of mine, both helped me out with my book on the Alamo. And two guys, if you don't know much about history, these are the first two guys you should go to. Okay, what they don't know isn't worth knowing. Don Frazier, Steve Hardin, I hope you enjoy their presentations.
My name is Evan Williams, a history major at McMurry University, and I love the layout of the Go To website. I mean, it is singularly built from the ground up with user convenience in mind. Every study available is within a single courses tab, with each lesson having a single page for each of its individual videos, text, visuals, and quizzes, all at easy grasp. This is most definitely history made simple.
Please log on to www.gotohistory.com.
And again, we're back. This is Paul Fabrizio.
And I'm Don Frazier, and this is Jeffrey Kinlaw.
And we're talking about philosophy. Jeff Kinlaw, of course, is the philosopher on campus. And we wanted to get into a little bit about your background. And did you start out to become a philosopher?
I just wouldn't fall off the back of a pickup and say, I think I'll be a philosopher.
At age 6, did you go, yeah, I'm going to be a philosopher?
No, actually.
You had a picture of Plato in your wall.
I'm a philosophy buff.
It's a real, it was a real surprising path.
Surprised by philosophy.
Well, no, surprising in the sense that you would not have predicted it.
Okay.
Okay, I didn't major in philosophy in college. I took several courses, but I didn't major in philosophy.
Okay, and where'd you go to college?
To Wake Forest.
Okay.
Wake Forest.
Okay. And so
I majored in history.
You majored in history.
Because he had achieved enlightenment early on in life.
Well, actually,
and then lost it.
Yeah, well, actually, I had div school in my head as well.
Divinity school.
Yeah, and that's what I did. And once I got there, I had at that time some language skills. I could read Greek pretty well. Mm-hmm. At that time, I've let it atrophy, I regret to say. But I discovered very quickly that I didn't want to do work in, say, biblical studies because I didn't like literary analyses.
Okay.
I didn't want to do that sort of thing. And I didn't want to do that type of what almost seemed to be, archival type work. I just didn't want to do it.
So
what
your
I
goal
did
was to be actually a theologian.
No, it wasn't. I mean, I didn't really have a set.
Okay.
That in the sense I'm going to be this or that.
Okay.
But I just knew that's a pathway I wanted to take, and I got interested in philosophy of religion. And
so asking the fundamental questions.
Well, I asked about. I got interested in theology and philosophy of religion. And so that's when I went to University of Virginia to do my PhD. Now, the interesting thing is, while I was there, I spent a lot of time in the philosophy department. A lot.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, at one time, considered switching programs, but didn't. I mean, I was encouraged to switch,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't. Fortunately, not by the religious studies department, but by the philosophy department.
Why don't you be a
Why don't you
philosopher
leave?
instead of-
Go to that building across the hall.
They've got donuts.
But I consider it and then realized no, and I didn't do it. But what I was able to do is to get my work in philosophical theology / philosophy of religion, which is what the program was in that part of the department. And I was able more or less to teach and write my way into a career as a philosopher. Now others have done this in
Teach and
different
write
ways.
your way into
Well,
it.
I mean,
that's an
look,
interesting
listen.
way to do it.
You
Well,
are
think
what
of
you
this.
teach. You are what you write.
Look, I know somebody in the UK who's a philosopher. He's well published. He has just finished a multi-year fellowship after which he's retiring.
Mm-hmm.
And he is recognized all over Europe, in the States, in Canada, and for the work he's done. His PhD's in French.
Really?
He wrote his way into
Philosophy.
being a philosopher.
Wow.
Does he
He wrote his
specialize in
way.
French philosophers?
No.
Wow.
He's done a lot of work on German philosophers because he's also fluent in German. But his PhD's in French literature.
Now, is he on the philosophy faculty someplace?
Not now, he's retired.
Okay, but he was at
He
one
was.
time.
He was. So,
Okay.
he was
Wouldn't
able
that-
to do that.
Wouldn't that
I
drive
mean,
the
you-
accrediting
But
agencies crazy?
well,
Yes,
yeah.
it would.
Think
Yes.
of this. A guy by the name of Bob Roberts recently retired from an endowed chair in the philosophy department at Baylor University.
Okay.
His background similar to mine,
Okay.
and except he did his work at Yale, and he goes to I think Wayne State University, and they need someone also to teach philosophy. And he started teaching philosophy. Well, he's very smart and he works very hard, and he started publishing articles in top tier journals, as in top 4 or 5
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy
in the
journals
world,
on
in the
Earth.
world, yeah, top tier journals. And after establishing himself extremely well, he gets lured away from the institution where he was at the time to Baylor with an endowed chair. And there was no question that the guy's talent as a philosopher, but he
Wow.
didn't start out that way.
Just based on his literature. Wow.
And
That's
it just, in his case, based on the fact that he had some background, of course.
Sure.
He didn't have the degree
Yeah.
specifically.
Correct.
His degree was in philosophical theology from Yale, but his background, but he started doing some very significant work in ethics,
Okay.
and published his way into an endowed chair in philosophy.
Makes
Okay.
perfect
Well,
sense.
let's ask you. You taught and wrote your way into being a philosopher. What drives you as a philosopher? What really interests you? Is it free will? Is there other?
There's certain questions. Well, but sometimes certain historical figures that you do, in the history of philosophy are what they dealt, the issues they dealt with within the culture in which they found themselves, what was going on in natural science,
Mhm.
et
The
cetera.
context.
Particularly with some of the people I write on, it was a watershed moment when you're recognizing Newtonian physics doesn't explain everything. How are we going to deal with organisms, et cetera? You've got biology, and medicine, which is in its infancy, chemistry still in its infancy.
So you're
And
interested
they're dealing with that period. Well, but some people are interested from just a scholarly point of view. I'm interested in the problems they're trying to solve because I think some of them are particularly pertinent today.
Still rolling around.
So I'm still interested in problems that they're trying to solve.
Okay.
And what are the ones that I'm most interested in? The ones I'm most interested in are certain questions related to philosophy of religion, certain questions in epistemology and certain questions in political theory.
So what time
that's what
period
it's in.
are we talking about? I mean, you
Time,
see,
my work is primarily on what's called classical German philosophy, or the German idealists of the late 18th, early 19th century.
oh wow,
Kant, Fichte, Hegel, Schleiermacher, etc.
about the time Napoleon's
also-
guys are walking down the road.
Precisely.
Yeah.
In fact, we had a
That's fascinating.
in fact, the Fichte Society back in 2014 had a whole conference, and of course, there's a conference volume. There's a volume of essays that was inspired by that conference, in which I have an essay in it on Fichte's speeches to the German nation. That was the title of it.
Yeah.
Which he wrote, which he was talking about moral and cultural reform in the aftermath of the fall of Berlin,
Yeah, because
the occupation of Berlin.
Napoleon broke everything up, so then you got to
And
reimagine
so, when you have, in his case, he was dealing with how do we deal with the whole collapse of the country, of the nation, and what he was interested in being, having done a lot of writing in ethics or moral theory anyway, and having done a lot of writing in ethics, he's now trying to say, okay, how do we talk about moral and political and cultural reform in the aftermath of the collapse of the Germanic states, or in this case for him, the collapse of the Prussian state.
yeah, because something clearly failed.
After the Battle of Jena,
Yeah,
in 1807, everything was occupied, and most of the universities were shut down.
And this is something that intrigues you to look at how they handle it
But
in the context of today.
Yeah, well, I'm more interested in not so much the context as the problems they're trying to solve.
yeah. Context would be us. We like the bayonets and the cannons
now
and
some
stuff.
some philosophers are interested in that historical context. I'm interested in the problems they're trying to solve, and the argument, and getting in and looking at the arguments they provide and analyzing the arguments, etc.
And the questions they're asking.
Do you think they have relevance for today?
No question.
Universal questions, like you said earlier.
No question. No question.
Asking the big questions of life.
I try to get, I'll give you an example of something from a classroom. This semester I'm teaching German political philosophy. Okay. Well, it's not German. I'm teaching Locke. We're dealing rights.
Yeah.
With the notion of rights and freedom and responsibility. So we did Locke, and now we did Fichte, Hegel, and we're going to do some Schleiermacher. But anyway, I asked students, I said, think about this. Now, to start with, before we deal with Hegel.
Okay, and we've got like 20 seconds.
Okay, if it's the case that you should see your freedom and your pursuit of freedom and your own aspirations should be able to be embodied in the institutions of the state and the institutions of society, what happens when they're not conducive but are obstacles?
Wow. So we're going to unpack that after this break. Thanks.
When you support McMurry History Education Group, you also support the many young workers who operate and maintain the company's digital operations. These are dedicated university students who handle many things such as filming, recording, and editing content for McMurry, as well as cultivate the layout and structure of McMurry's various websites, including its associated channel on YouTube. We are a nonprofit organization that exists from donations from interested persons and history enthusiasts alike. Donations enable our students to obtain a higher education, job training, and career bolstering skills. If you would like to donate, please visit us at www.mcwinnie.org and click on our About Us tab to learn more.
Welcome to State House Press, a nonprofit publisher of quality books. State House Press and the McWhinney Foundation Press are part of the Texas A&M University Press Consortium, which handles retail distribution for several small but distinguished publishers. Our entire list of offerings, with pictures, summaries, prices, and easy online ordering, is available in our section of the consortium website. State House Press is proud of its reputation for high standards of scholarship and readability. In addition to this, we at State House Press have recruited the talents of individuals such as Phil Collins on his book, The Alamo and Beyond, We release not only texana by contemporary authors, but reprints of classic accounts of Texas life and history otherwise inaccessible to the public. Our book list also incorporates the publications of the McMurry Foundation Press, specializing in the history of the Old South and the Civil War. We strive with our titles to make history accessible to as many readers as possible. To accomplish this task, we have recruited some of America's leading historians, as well as bright new scholars. We believe firmly in narrative history, in telling a good story, and in telling it well, without losing sight of the people who've made history and the events that changed a nation.
For questions or business inquiries, please visit the Texas Book Consortium at www.tamupress.com.
This portion of the show is reserved for advertisements. If you are interested in filling this portion with ads for your business, please call 325-793-4686 or email director@tfhcc.com.
And we're back. I'm Paul Fabrizio.
I'm Don Frazier, and we are wrapped up in the middle of a very interesting conversation with Jeffrey Kinlaw,
Yes.
our university philosopher.
Yeah, well, let me come back to what we're
Please.
talking about. I don't want to go into detail with it. It's just an example.
Yes.
I mean, for instance, in Hegel's case, he was convinced that in the modern state, particularly, that the constitution of the Prussian state in the early part of the 19th century, but in the modern state, that there was or should be the potential and the possibility for any given individual to have not only her pursuits, her freedom, her aspirations, and so forth, fulfillable within the institutions of the state. But the genuine freedom is to be able to recognize and see that as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you find that the institutions of the state and of society are conducive to, supportive of, at least in principle.
Yeah, theoretically, yes.
Supportive of the pursuit of your freedom, the pursuit of your aspirations.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of motivate kids thinking about this first of the semester. And I say, well, what happens if that's not true? I said, it's certainly the case that in many histories of countries that this hasn't been true.
Yeah, correct.
Even
as we speak.
I said, most Americans like to feel that way about their own country.
Right.
But that certainly wasn't the case for African Americans, to say the least.
Right.
Correct.
Certainly wasn't
The
the case.
institutions were not there for their freedom.
No, the institutions were there. In some instances, they were tweaked to be impediments,
Right.
as opposed to being conducive to the freedom. And the interesting thing about King, is
Martin
that
Luther King Jr.
about King was one of the central arguments he gave is that the way in which these institutions have been, in a sense, tweaked or corrupted for the purpose of oppressing or being an impediment for African Americans, was not consistent with the laws of the land and with.
So it might be something like voter ID laws.
Right.
Would that be something?
Well,
voter ID.
Well, it depends. I mean, voter ID. People see these as benign.
Yeah.
But the reason the voter ID, in a lot of instances, there's so much criticism of voter ID laws is, let's take the example of Alabama. So what do you have? You have a very strict voter ID law that was passed in Alabama. At the same time, DMVs were closed in a lot of the African American neighborhoods, requiring people sometimes to go 30 miles to a DMV to get their driver's license renewed or to get one for the first time. Yeah. Now, here, this is, when you take a voter ID law, which a lot of people think is benign.
Yeah, on the surface.
And
seems
you
to be.
then append that to, which shows what your real ideal was.
The question behind the question.
Yeah. Or, for instance, you don't, why do we, in the state of Texas, we do not allow student IDs. A photo ID, a government-issued photo ID.
For students who go to public universities.
But
it's not allowed to vote.
That doesn't count.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why doesn't it count?
Right.
Because they want to make it harder for those people to vote.
Right.
So, I mean, there's the,
So the question that you look at by studying 1800s Germany is very, very relevant to today.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, the problems that philosophers tried to resolve are always trying to resolve. I mean, for instance, you start with you've got people trying to deal with the mind-body problem, and now that's become a cottage industry. Philosophy of mind.
The what?
The relationship between mind and body.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay.
Do minds even exist?
Okay.
How do we understand the relationship between
Wait,
the
didn't
mental
Descartes
and
answer
the
that?
physical?
I think,
No,
therefore I am?
No, Descartes had a strict dualism between the mental and the physical. And
Don't bait the philosopher.
excuse me.
I read Descartes.
It didn't solve anything.
So why, I guess what you're trying to hit at is the entire question of,
And Jeff is
Sorry.
losing his
That's
voice
right.
here.
No, I've got allergy issues.
yeah, that's all right, man, is why would anybody need to take philosophy?
That is the question. And then the second question is, if there's somebody out there who's watching this and says, what do you look for in a philosopher? What do you look for in a student? Someone who you think could succeed, excel in philosophy. What is it about that student?
All right, in an intro class, if you have a student who's capable of analyzing a problem
Mm-hmm.
or a part of a text, and that person can make some really good fine distinctions,
Yeah.
there's a candidate.
Wow.
That's
So
all.
someone who can slice and
But
dice
what I
something.
mean is, but think about it. You've got to be able to dissect what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to be able to see that here's the flow of the argument, and that it turns on making this distinction that, or its interpretation turns on this distinction that, and they're able to do that. That's an indication you got a candidate.
That's cool. Now, how would that be useful postgraduate?
Well, it's useful in the general sense that you've got to bring that skill with you.
Yeah. Do you think employers would value that skill?
Yeah.
Well, of course they would. And the thing is, we live in a time, and it's certainly the case on our campus, where everybody does critical thinking.
Right.
And I will admit that once when we were in a debate, and you two probably remember when we were having this debate about the gen ed curriculum about a decade and a half ago.
Okay,
is that
we got less than a minute.
We got into this, about critical thinking, and I said, well, yeah, but that's like saying I stayed in the Holiday Inn last night, going back to the old commercial.
Yeah.
But but philosophers offer a unique approach to teaching that skill if you're interested in what is simply a skill.
Right.
As opposed to what an educated person should know.
Yeah, philosophers will train your mind in certain ways to be able to analyze things.
Which is why it is not not surprising that if you take postgraduate first job, and then you look at the height of the person's career, the point at which they usually make the most.
Yeah.
The curve up is higher for philosophy than it is the others.
All right, that's the final word. Class dismissed.